Hello and welcome to the latest TES live web chat. I'm Ed Dorrell and I'm features and comment editor here at the TES.
It's going very well so far, isn't it?
It is going well, I think, yeah. Today, as I'm sure you all know, is World Book Day, and as such, I'm delighted to have with us in the studio Tony Robinson, who no doubt you will recognise from the likes of Black Adder and the long-standing presenter of Time Team, Channel 4's archaeology show. Today we'll be talking about World Book Day itself, getting kids into reading, getting kids into history, Tony's amazing career, no doubt, inevitably touching on Baldrick and Time Team. So if you want to join in the conversation, please do by using the Twitter hashtag TSLive or emailing your questions to webchat@ts.co.uk. Firstly, Tony, can you tell us a bit about World Book Day, which I think you're heavily involved with? And while you're at it, tell us a little bit about your World Book Day book.
Well, I imagine that most teachers watching now will be pretty exhausted by World Book Day. It's been so big this year. Last year, worldwide, I think the live streaming went to something like 500,000 children. This year, I don't know how many it's been, because they haven't done the full head count, but I know that it's exceeded 650, and that was with, I think, 2 or 3 days to go. And even when I was driving into the live show at the Queen Elizabeth Hall, I could see all the kids going into their primary schools all dressed up as their different characters. It was started 17 years ago, I think, by UNESCO in order to promote literacy. And to be quite frank, I think we in Britain do it very well.
Good.
And we have this show, the biggest book show in the world, which is streamed live to over 40 countries. And I think Vietnam's got it this year, the Seychelles, India, China, Canada.
Amazing.
And I love the idea. I'm a bit sceptical about days in inverted commas.
Yeah.
Every day seems to be a day for some damn thing. But I think this is great. It just says we are going to celebrate literacy. And there's not a bad thing about it, really.
No, there's not. It's hard to argue with.
And the reason I'm involved is I write this series called Tony Robinson's Weird World of Wonders. My idea is I want to write a book about everything. But I think it might take me in excess of 27,000 years. So I've done the Greeks and the Romans, British Empire, that kind of thing so far. I've got World War II coming out in about...
Due this week,
I don't know. I ought to know. Next week, says somebody from the publishers just off screen. And I was asked, and I can't tell you how flattered I was to be asked to write one of the World Book Club books, which is this one, Tony Robinson's Weird World of Wonders, Inventions, and it goes alongside Horrid Henry and Anthony Horowitz and Shirley Hughes and
serious players.
So I was sitting up there were like 7 great British writers and me up there today, and it's been really good. And the idea is that there is this live show where various writers that kids will identify with and know about. They can see them up there, and they talk not just about reading skills but about writing skills as well. And there was extraordinary unanimity about us, which surprised me. For instance, I asked the quick, because I was presenting it as well as just being one of the writers there, and I asked them, just off my own bat, whether they write using computer or pen and paper.
Oh yes.
And virtually all of them use pen and paper.
That's very interesting. Do you?
I do, yeah. Well, I have the best of both worlds. I use pen and paper, and then I say it out loud because my training was as an actor. So, as you may have noticed, any excuse to talk out loud I would take. I say it to my assistant, who then types it out for me, and then I work on those drafts. But there is something, we all agreed, there's something so tactile about pen and paper, the way that you can move it all around, the way that you can have all the pages on the table in front of you and shuffle them around. And it wasn't like that the oldies used pen and paper and the youngies used their
iPad.
No O-levels. I don't think anybody else in the country has got that. So anyway, I left school at 16, and because I'd been a child actor, so I was only at school about half the time. And although I loved writing. I hadn't been kind of successful as a child with my essays or anything. And then when I was in my late 30s, and I was doing Blackadder. And because everybody thought that everybody in Blackadder must have been to a very good public school, probably been head boy, then gone to either Oxford or Cambridge, read classics and got a first.
Yes, done footlights.
Unless they'd been arrested, gone to jail and taken loads of drugs like Stephen, in which case they'd have gone up a second or something like that. You know. But I think it was Hutchinson said to me, would I like to write a book? And I was interested in writing about the Greeks at that time because I'd been working at the National Theatre for about a year and a half on Aeschylus.
Okay.
And so I was passionate about that birth of Western artistic endeavour.
Wow.
And so I said, yeah, I want to write a book on Odysseus. So they said, all right. And then I thought, I can't write a book. I've never written a book of my life before. So I went to see Richard Curtis and said, will you help me? Will you do a book with me? And he said, well, you can write it on your own. I said, I can't. I wouldn't know how to do it. So he said, all right, you write the first chapter, then come to Oxford where he lived and read it through. So I wrote the first chapter and he listened to it and he said, well, you want to cut those first two paragraphs. I mean, you're starting so far back in the story and come in tight here. And look at that character there. That's not a character. It's just a cipher, isn't it? She's a servant. Who is she? Where did she come from? How many children has she got? Why is she funny? Or is she not funny? Is she tragic? So he would be asking me all those kinds of things. And then occasionally he would write, if I'd written a paragraph that he didn't like, he would just rewrite it.
Oh, really?
And say to me, does that work for you? And then I would go back and I'd write the second chapter and third. And then we wrote the second book together. And then we wrote the third book together. And at the end of I was commissioned to do a fourth book. And I rang him and said, Richard, would you mind if I do this one on my own? Because I don't need you to write with me anymore. Because I can hear your voice all the time. So actually, I'm putting in your corrections before you've even corrected them. And he said, don't you realise that is the moment that I've been waiting for? He's an incredibly generous man. Why did he bother to do that? He was already, very successful. So I managed to get tutorials on 3 books from the man who turned out to be the most successful Hollywood writer that England's ever produced. So I was very lucky.
Not bad going, eh? So this is our first contributors question. Brian Turner, who is 12, wants tips on writing. How long do you do it for? Is it all day, every day? How do you motivate yourself? That's me paraphrasing that last one.
How do I motivate myself? How do I make myself want to do it? It's because I enjoy it so much. And because if I've written a bit of a story, even if it's factual, I mean, even factual books have stories in this invention, how the thing was invented, why the thing was invented, what happened next. I've got to make the people who are reading it gagging to find out what happens next. The only way to do that is if I really, really want to know what happens next. So I guess that's what motivates me. How long do I write? Well, I write where and whenever I want to. The actual process of putting the stuff on paper, and I don't know if it's the same with you, is really secondary to the thinking that's gone on beforehand. So an awful lot of the writing I do isn't writing at all. It's pacing around the room, looking out the window, thinking, oh, I haven't cut my toenails for ages. Does that pencil need sharpening? All those strategies that writers use in order to avoid writing are sort of part of the writing process anyway, in a weird sort of way. Even just going down the street and you see a funny thing happening. This morning on World Book Day, I said how I'd seen someone opposite me in the tube this morning. There was a boy, and he was dying to sneeze, and he couldn't sneeze. He didn't feel he was allowed to sneeze in this carriage. And then eventually he did sneeze because he was so tensed up. It kind of went, and I thought he must have swallowed a toy trumpet, or he must have had a toy trumpet up his nose rather. And I thought, that's it. That's the beginning of a book about a boy who has a toy trumpet up his nose. And that's writing. It was going to work, but it was writing. The actual thing about kind of sitting down and actually doing the writing, I don't know, because eventually I've just got all this stuff going on in my head. It's just my way of getting it out. It's like a huge sneeze, if you like. and
a word sneeze.
Yeah, a word sneeze, absolutely. That's what this do. I tell you, the world of wonders, the Greeks. A word sneeze.
Excellent. Mrs. White 33 says she loved you in Blackadder, she loves Time Team, and her kids love your history books. But she wants to know, have you always loved history? Which I suppose
Yes.
relates a bit to your previous question.
Yes, I have always loved history. I love the way everyone knows you're 33 now, by the way. But anyway.
No, Mrs. White 33 is her handle, if you will.
Oh, I thought it meant she was 33, like
No.
like the boy was 12. Oh, yes, because look, it says, Brian Turner, age 12, Mrs. White, 33. How was I to know? Anyway.
We don't know how old Mrs. White is.
No, she's 17. Mrs. White, have I always been interested in history? Yes, I have, but I didn't know it was called history. I think virtually from the moment I left the womb, my dad started telling me funny stories about his adventures in the Second World War. I mean, like every one of his generation, almost the most vivid 5 years of his life was in the Second World War, and he was a young working class boy, away from home for the first time, mixing with all sorts of people he'd never mixed with before, having all sorts of adventures. I mean, he didn't have a great war. He wasn't a war hero. He was up in Scotland servicing Hurricanes and Spitfires so that posher kids could fly up in the air and shoot down the Germans or be shot down themselves. He learnt to play boogie piano. He was in the Canadian Forces dance band in Scotland.
Fabulous.
He just had such a great time, and he would tell me all about it. I remember one daft story that he told me was where the siren went and they realised that an enemy plane was very near, and he sprinted over to the machine gun post. They'd all been trained how to fire a machine gun, and in his macho way, he was shorter than me, he was about 5'3.5". He seized the machine gun, and they'd all been told you only fire it in short bursts, because otherwise it would overheat. He saw this plane coming, he just went minute after minute until it overheated and stopped. And just before it did, he saw it spiralling down and plummet into the sea, and all his mates went, yeah, and he went into the NAFI, and he went, I've shot down a German plane, and they all cheered and put him on his shoulders and all that stuff, and the squadron leader came out and congratulated himself. Then the next morning, the squadron leader called him into his office and told him that all 27 machine gun posts down that length of coast had claimed the same plane the previous night. And there was something, I mean, yes, it was funny, but also it was interesting because it was about the war, so I'm thinking, at a very young age, what is this war? What does war mean? Who are these people that they were fighting? The Canadians were involved. Who are the Canadians? Where's Canada? What's a machine gun? Why would it overheat? Somehow you ask those questions because you've been told not just a story, but you've been told a story in the context of a relationship, me and my dad. And I'm passionate about adults telling stories to their kids. I know by the time the child is 9 or 10, they would be so embarrassed by their parents, they would attempt to go away. But, St Ignatius Loyola's maxim will have worked by then. The child will be ours. They'll know about narrative. So when I went to school, I couldn't believe that people actually gave marks for this thing that you'd want to know about anyway, wouldn't you? To me,
I would have thought so.
To me, history is as fundamental to who I am as growing a beard is to you.
To me, yes,
yeah.
Which is pretty fundamental.
and it always has been. And I think in my books, my modest aim is just to say to kids, actually, this stuff is a blast.
It's fascinating. Yeah.
And it's and how can you know who you are unless you know where you came from? It doesn't make any sense. We only talk the language that we do because of what people talked before.
Sure.
We're only in this room because other people pulled down other buildings in Red Lion Square and built this magnificent tribute to postmodern architecture, where the whole nature of the way that we're communicating to people out there, what's all that about? It's all about story, it's all about history. And sorry, I could need to have another question.
That's where your love comes from.
Yeah.
Neil, it relates actually, it's a really great question.
Who is 11?
Who is 11?
Yeah.
He wants to know, if you could travel back in time, which bit of history would you visit?
I think the first thing I'd say about that is if I could travel back to live anywhere in time, I would travel out and travel straight back again and live now. I think we are the luckiest bunnies in the warren. Mm-hmm. I think that living in the early 21st century, it's so incredibly interesting. The changes that are being made are so huge. I mean, we were saying earlier that I One of my great friends was the editor of the TES up to about 10 years ago, and then she tragically died. The changes that have just taken place here, the fact that we're communicating in the way that we are now in that 10 years is just weird and wild and wonderful. But also, more importantly, most of us are going to be warm, we're going to have a roof over our head, we're unlikely to be beaten to shreds by either stray maniacs or the police or the army before the day is out. There are so many things that we are secure in that virtually nobody in the world ever has been. Sure. So that, you know, now is the history. Yeah. Now is history, because that now that we just said a sentence ago is history, isn't it? So yeah, now is the history that I would like to live in. But just to be a voyeur, just to be curious. Well, you'd have to go back to about 32 AD in Jerusalem and see actually what happened round about the time of the crucifixion. You know, whether you're a Christian, a Muslim, an atheist, or whatever, you know, to see that story firsthand and to think, oh, that's just how I imagined it. No, that's not how I imagined it at all. Oh, I'm going to have to rethink, or whatever. You know, really interesting. Also, being English, I think I'd like to go back to the time of Alfred the Great. You know, a couple of hundred years before William the Conqueror, and really there isn't an England as we know it. There's this wild, tempestuous country which, by and large, is being turned over by the Vikings. Until eventually King Alfred, who was never meant to be the king at all, he was the youngest of about 5 sons. He was like, you know, Glasses boy studying in Rome, while the others are Punch boy learning how to kill. But they all got killed, and Glasses boy is called back from Rome, and he's made king. And there's just about 25 square miles of England left round Athelney in Somerset. And if we lose that, then you and I would now be eating bacon and talking Danish. But that didn't happen, I don't think. All because of Alfred. How did he turn that country around in a remarkably short time? Within about 2 years, the Viking king Guthrum was being paraded ceremoniously round southern England, dressed in white and with sort of pretend bonds on his hand of white silk, showing that he had surrendered his heart to the English god. He'd turned his back on Thor and Odin and Freya and all that lot. Wow, it's just weird. How did he do it? Presumably, he must have had, you know, his whole army of Michael Goves and George Osbornes behind him, wheeling and dealing. But you know, you don't hear about those in the books. And as far as Bishop Asser, who wrote his first biography, is concerned, the man did it out of the force of his own intellect and charisma. And I suspect that there was a lot in that. I suspect he really was very brilliant. But I would love to go back to that time, find out what he was really like, and also to work out what all that nonsense about the burnt cakes was. One of the most obscure stories in British history. Yes,
that's fabulous. Your world book. No, I'm going to go with Harry, who's 13.
Yeah.
He asks, "What do you read? Do you have time to read?" And similarly, everyone in the office wants to know what your favourite book was. For the record, mine is Catch-22.
Catch-22, that's a good one. Yeah. I think my favourite grown-ups book would have to be a George Eliot, and I think it would probably be Middlemarch. Okay. I just think it's exquisite, and I love the idea of trying to live the good life and blowing it like about every 20 seconds. You know, there is something about George Eliot which in a way is so measured and wise, and you know there's this cat underneath howling and scratching, and just everything about her books I think is absolutely magic. Now it's funny actually, because I was talking to the author of Horrid Henrys earlier on today, and I had mentioned on stage that my favourite book from childhood was an American book called Half Magic by a writer called Edward Eager, and that was around in the early 50s. And I'd never heard anybody else even mention that book let alone say it was their favourite. And she suddenly turned to me in the middle of this big do in front of 750,000 people and said, "But that's my favourite children's book too."
So what was it again?
It's called Half Magic. It's by Edward Eager. I think it's still available in Puffin, but I'm not absolutely... I'm sure after the way we've talked it up, it will be. But the lovely thing is, it's such a simple premise, and when all of the writers were talking about plotting in particular this morning, they were saying, you'd keep the premise simple, because you can explode out from the premise. If you're overloaded by your premise, it keeps getting in the way of the narrative later on. And all it is that these kids pick up a little coin, and this coin gives you any wish that you could possibly wish for, except it only gives you half of it. The other half just goes incredibly wrong.
Oh, wow.
And then you're forced into a situation where you're saying, "I wish," and it happens. So, like, oh God, I wish you would shave that beard off. Or you didn't even think it, and woof, off it comes. You know, I don't mean you. I'm just saw it there and used it as a metaphor. And of course, lots of amazing scrapes happen. And I think it was the first time, and I like an awful lot of middle class kids. I was really avaricious about books. I don't think I'd ever read a narrative book which was so funny before.
That's
and
great,
suddenly hearing narrative carry humour, because I think an awful lot of the books that I used to read were things like Biggles and Percy F. Westerman, the last throes of empire and how brave to be as a boy. Well, I was never really going to stand up very well as far as that's concerned. But all this comedy stuff, people ending up with a blazing Christmas pudding stuck on the end of their nose. That was my world.
So we've got comedy and history, which means I'm going to inevitably have to ask you about Blackadder. At History Lover, this must be from Twitter, asks if being renowned as Baldric has ever been something of an albatross.
No, absolutely not. No, because if you imagine it from my point of view, I think I was 38 when Blackadder started. Okay. I'd started as a child actor when I was just 13. So that means I had been doing it for a quarter of a century, only ever with a modicum of success. The small successes felt like huge triumphs. And suddenly, to be amongst all these dazzling intellects, creating with them, and to be in this show which everybody seemed to think was iconic, and to have been given a character which was so iconic that virtually every organisation in the country had somebody in it who they called Baldric. Can you imagine how just fantastic that was for me? Had it happen to me earlier, I think I would have probably been a bit more cynical about it and gone, "Oh, don't ask me about Baldric. That's something that happened. That was just one character I played out of many in my quiver." But no, I've never felt about that. I've just
You've embraced
thank
it.
you. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I feel like I'm here. It's like he's a national building and I'm his caretaker. I just get up every morning, sort of polish his windows and.
You must get it a lot in the street, do you? People
get what?
People shouting Baldric.
Oh, sorry.
Boom, boom, boom at you.
Oh, yes. You get all that a lot. But also, you see, I get as many. You can dig my garden anytime you like.
Oh, yeah, of course.
And the Maid Marian generation, the people who were children at that time.
I was.
They remember me from that and go pancake day or words to that effect. And now what's lovely is that there's this new generation who are beginning to see me as product placement, as a children's writer, which is
lovely.
It's lovely because I've written about 27, 28 children's books, 4 or 5 adults books, and they've all done all right. No publisher that I've ever written for has slashed their wrists and never been seen again. But actually, to be part of something that's as big as this is
really
great.
Successful.
And the lovely thing about Weird World of Wonders is it isn't just the book. We got Aardman to make an online game, and it's had something like 14 million hits. The game, and I read the books, but I read them like I would read them, mad reading, and that's all online, and the website is great. And
have a look. I've looked. It is great.
It's the fun thing about it is that everybody nowadays says that a new idea, you want it to be multimedia on lots of different platforms,
Sure.
each platform fertilising the other, all this language, and it never is. It's the one that led it, whether it's the newspaper that funded it, or the book publisher, or the television station. They always run with it. They always had the money, and everything else is an add-on
Follows, yeah.
in a basement studio.
Not that we're an add-on, of course.
But the great thing about Weird World of Wonders is that on the first day when I talked to Macmillan's about it, all the different people from all the different departments were there, and we've done it together. And I guess probably that's going to be the way forward. But it's a budgeting thing, isn't it? It's actually having the confidence to giving those other aspects of what your organisation does, the budget to do that other thing as well as the core thing.
Yes, absolutely. I'm going to take you quickly back to Blackadder because I want to know. No. In fact, that's a lie. Several people, in fact, have emailed in asking.
You don't want to know at all.
I do want to know, but other people have asked as well, I'm told, if there's any danger ever of another series. Because it does come up, it gets talked about every now and again, doesn't it?
It does.
The rumours, someone writes a story in a paper.
It usually happens in the silly season. It usually happens because somebody has said something like Rowan might say, "Oh, yes, of course, I'd love to do a Blackadder again." But that's just like a kind of noise that you make, if you know what I mean. There has always been this idea in the back of Ben and Richard's head, and I know Ben would love to do another series, that at some time when we're all really, really old, that we would do another series. Although Richard says that as I'm 10 years older than anybody else, I can only have short bits in scenes because I'll be so incontinent by that time, which I think is a little cruel. But whether or not we'll ever get to the situation where we can afford to pay Hugh Laurie,
Oh, well, of course.
I don't know. Maybe he could do it for charity.
He just do it out of the goodness of his heart.
Yeah. But there are no firm plans at all at the moment. But quite honestly, as long as people keep talking about it, I think it keeps the dream alive. So hopefully the time will come, let's be honest, when Richard Curtis will be on his uppers. He'll do anything for a few bob, and at that time I think that's when we leap.
Excellent. You've got to wait for that Hollywood blooper then.
Yes.
The one that goes wrong.
I think that was the one about the pirate radio show,
Oh,
wasn't
yeah.
it?
Less said about that, the better, I think. Someone who calls themselves Archigeek wants to talk about your other famous series, Time Team, and wants to know how you felt about it being cancelled, especially since everyone seems to know about archaeology, what with Richard III and Leicester.
Well, to take the second half of the question first, boy, was I hacked off when they didn't ask me to present the programme about Richard III. Oh, I was green with envy for about a week. But, time moves on, and Channel 4 have obviously decided that they want new programmes and new faces. It's kind of frustrating because Time Team is currently being seen by more people than have ever seen it before. But by and large, that's on More 4 and on Yesterday, or repeats, which means the first programme tends not to be seen by so many people. Why would they bother to take that time out when they know they're going to be able to see it for the next 7 years if they want to look it up? That means that the first show isn't getting the ratings that it did. Once that started happening, they moved it earlier in the afternoon, so it got even less good ratings. So now they look at it and they go, the ratings have halved for the first show. And of course, television always thinks the first showing is the most important because that's where you get the advertising, the big advertising. So they decided it wasn't doing the business for them anymore. And in all fairness, it is a very expensive show to make. It probably cost between 160 and 180,000 pounds an hour. Now you for a prime time show, you'd be prepared to spend that money for one that's going out at 4:30. Why, when you can just do a rerun of some property show? Doesn't hold the attraction.
No, sure.
So I'm philosophical about it. I'm a freelance. What freelance gets a job 20 years running?
Absolutely.
My bank manager's not quite as
happy.
Yes, as philosophical as I am.
Back to the books. Someone who goes by the name Little Kitten asks about the response to your books. Do you think kids these days have the same love of reading that you must have done?
By and large, yes, I do. I think kids can be absolutely passionate about reading, whether it's the book or whether it's Kindle or whether they're reading on their computer screen. Yes, it is true that there are a lot of kids who feel very alienated from reading. They feel that reading is something for the posher kids or the cleverer kids or just different kids, kids from a different culture. And it's precisely because of those kids that we've set up World Book Day. We want everybody to know that reading is for them, and it can be great, and it can transform their lives.
Because children's writing itself is in really rude health, isn't it?
It's fantastic. And when I was next to those other 7 writers today, so full of ideas and ambition for books and such clarity and such good storytellers, I couldn't have been in better company.
Absolutely. Librarian extraordinaire has an interesting follow-up to that. You are, she, or I presume she, or he says...
Before you ask me that question, can I tell you what happened just then? You glanced at your watch, and I thought, that means we've come to the end. So I quickly wound up. I gave you a fantastic out to the programme, and then you asked another question.
Sorry.
So you were just bored, really, when you went...
I was just seeing how much longer we've got left.
There's nobody left watching.
I hope not. No, I'm going to get this one in because it's interesting and it's something which our readers especially care an awful lot about.
Yeah.
Librarian extraordinaire asks, observes that you are something of a political activist as well, and as such, have you been involved or would you involve yourself in any campaigns to save libraries?
Yes, I am a political activist. I think with a small p with a big than with a big P. In the same way that I think I live and breathe history. I think I live and breathe politics because I don't want to be on my deathbed thinking I just moaned all the time and never tried to do anything about it. So, would I ever do anything about libraries? I did a huge plug for the value of public libraries this morning when I was doing a live show. Excuse me keeping coughing. I'm just I have done a very long live show this morning. And essentially what I said was this World Book Day is being watched not just in schools, not just in cinemas, but in this most fantastic of institutions that we've got in Britain, which is the free libraries where people can go and read books for free. And I think that's really exciting, really important. As a British person, I'm really proud of it. Long may it reign. Now, that's not going on a march, that's not signing a petition, but actually that would have been seen by 750,000 people. And so, in a sense, I've done a little bit of political activism today, and by repeating it, I've now done it twice.
Great, thank you. We've got one final question actually, which is a good way of winding up. Tina Edwards, who's a teacher in the West Midlands, asks, have you got a message for her class of 14-year-olds about reading?
Yeah, just one question. Read anything and read everything. Do you know, one of the things that excited me most that I read when I was young was the ingredients on the back of a pickle jar. It's true, it's really true. It had words on it like cardamom. I had no idea what cardamom was. Pimiento. What the heck's a pimiento? Saffron. Wonderful words. I just loved the sound of those words. I wanted to know. I'd poke around in the pickle jar with my fork to see if a pimiento would come to the surface. And just the fun of reading that thing is great. Read little bits from newspapers, read cartoons, anything that you can get your hands on. And to the mums and dads and teachers, I would say, obviously there are going to be times where as a parent you're going to be a little bit cautious about what a kid might read. But by and large, I would say let them read anything, because that way they're going to find out what they think's good and what they think's bad. And once they've developed their own taste, you're there, aren't you? That is such a great and sophisticated thing to do. That they're going to read forever once they got taste. So read everything and let them read everything. That would be my maxim.
Fantastic, thank you. So all that's left is for me to thank Tony for coming into these here TES towers. Thank you for watching, and to wish you all a very happy World Book Day.
Product placement for the last time. Tony Robinson's Weird World of Wonders. Buy it in your shop.